Good morning, everyone. In the last session, we discussed about banner in the Spring Boot. Whenever we run boot application, one logo will be printed on the console. That logo is called as banner, right? So by default, it will print Spring logo as a banner. In the Spring Boot, banner is working based on modes. There are three modes available for the banner. One is console, which is by default. If you want, you can set the mode as a log also, so that banner will be printed on the log file. If you don't want to print the banner, you can set the mode as off, banner will not be printed. You can change banner text also by creating banner.txt file under the resources folder. Okay, next one. We discussed about runners in the Spring Boot. Runner is an interface in the Spring Boot. There are two types of runners available. One is called application runner. Second one is called command line runner. Why we need these runners? If you want to execute any logic only one time when the application started. If you want to execute the logic only one time when the application is started, then we will go for runners concept. We are having two types of runners in the Spring Boot. One is called application runner. Second one is called command line runner. These two interfaces are functional interfaces in the Spring Boot. What is the meaning of a functional interface? What is the meaning of functional interface? Only the interface which contains only one abstract method is called as a functional interface. Now, if you go for application runner, there is a run method. So if you want to create your own runner, you need to implement that application runner and you need to override run method. And next one, command line runner. This is also a interface which is having run method. If you want to go with the command line runner, then need to implement run method. The difference is this run method will take application args as a parameter, which includes our command line arguments as well as VM arguments also. But if you go for this run method, it will take only string args, which are nothing but our command line arguments. So you can create any number of runners in our application. Those runners will be executed only once when the application is started. Next one, we discussed about bean life cycle. So how we have thread life cycle, servlet life cycle, JSP life cycle. Similarly, Spring Bean also having life cycle. That means the object creation, the object destruction will be taken care by Spring IOC container. We are representing our Java class as a Spring Bean class. When we represent Java class as a Spring Bean, that a class will be managed by IOC container. Object creation, object destruction will be taken care by IOC container. When IOC container creating the object and destroying the object, we can execute some lifecycle methods. The lifecycle methods we can execute in the programmatic approach, we can execute in the annotation approach also. If you go for programmatic approach, there are two interfaces available. One is called initializing bean. Next one is called disposable bean. Initializing bean having a method called after properties set. Disposable bean having a method called destroy. Okay, there are two interfaces available. So I want to achieve lifecycle methods programmatically, then implement two interfaces and override methods. Initializing bean having after property set method. This will be called once the bean object is created. Disposable bean having destroy method. This will be called before removing the object from IOC container. So like this, you can do this. Is it mandatory to implement two interfaces? Is it mandatory to implement both interfaces? No, only one is sufficient. Okay, the next one is bean lifecycle with the annotations. If you don't want to go for programmatic approach, you can go for annotation approach. There are two interfaces available, post construct and pre-destroy. Post construct we can use at the method. that method will execute when the object is created. We can consider post construct method as a init method. When the object is created, this method will be executed. Next one is pre-destroy. So before object is deleted, our destroy method will be executed. So method name can be anything. You just need to write the proper annotations for that. Okay, with this we understood bean life cycle. So can you quickly summarize what we learnt in the Spring Boot, guys? We discussed about Spring versus Spring Boot. So Spring is a framework. Spring Boot is extension for the Spring framework. We can develop applications by using Spring. We can develop application by using Boot also. What is the difference? If you develop with the Spring, then you need to manage lot of configurations. But when you go for Spring Boot, auto configuration is available. So if anyone asks, what is a Spring Boot? What is the answer? What is a Spring Boot? Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based application with less configuration. Spring Boot is an extension for Spring framework. In the Spring, manually we need to do the configuration. In the Spring Boot, auto configuration is available. Advantages with the boot. What are the advantages with the Spring Boot? We are having form starters, dependency version conflict solution, auto configuration, embedded server, actuator. What is actuator? Actuator is used to monitor and manage our application by using endpoints. Boot provided actuators to monitor and manage our application. What is the embedded server? What is embedded server? When you run the application, web application, you no need to deploy in the server. Boot will provide the ready-made server for us. Tomcat, Jetty, Netty, like that there are 3 types of embedded servers. What is the default server we are getting? Tomcat. Can we change that? Yes. We will learn in the WebMVC how to change that. Next one, auto configuration. What is auto configuration? Identify the configuration required for the application and provide that configuration based on the form.xml. Based on our form.xml starters, Boot will identify what configuration required for our application. Dependency versions. You no need to configure version number for the dependency. Boot will identify the version. What is the form starter? It is simplifying our Maven configuration. Okay, advantages with the Spring Boot, we are clear. Creating Spring Boot application. How can we create Spring Boot application? 2 ways. One is by using initializer website and by using IDE, start.spring.io. If you use IDE also, internally will communicate with the initializer website. Internet connection is a mandatory when you are creating the boot application. Next one, what is boot application folder structure? Boot application folder structure. When you create Spring Boot application, main Java, main resources, test Java, test resources, pom.xml will be available. In the main Java folder, there will be a start class. Can you tell me what is a start class in the Spring Boot? What is the start class in the Spring Boot? Start class is entry point for boot application execution. For every Spring Boot application, one start class is required, which will contain a main method. Whether it is a standalone application or whether it is a web application, execution will start from main method. Now, inside that start class, what is Spring application.run method? Spring application.run method. Spring application is a predefined class. Inside that run method is available. From our main method, we are calling this run method. What is happening inside the run method? It is doing so many things. Prepare the context, prepare the environment, print the banner, prepare IOC, create the IOC, prepare the IOC, call the runners, and return IOC object. So lot of things are happening inside the run method. How IOC will be created in Spring Boot? In the Spring, manually we need to create the IOC container object. But in the Spring Boot, it is automated. How IOC will be started in Spring Boot? Do I need to start programmatically, or boot will take care of that? Boot will take care of starting the IOC, because IOC is a common for every project. Okay, when we are developing a project by using Spring, everybody should start the IOC. When that logic is common for everyone, why everyone should write that logic? That is automated in the Spring Boot. So how IOC will be started in the Spring Boot? Based on the starter. If I add a normal starter, annotation config application context class. If I have web starter, some other class. If I have reactive starter, some other class. So based on starter available in the pom.xml, IOC container will be started in our application. Okay, next one. What is @Spring Boot application annotation? What is @Spring Boot application annotation? It is equal to 3 annotations, guys. This one annotation is equal to 3 annotations. What are those 3 annotations? @boot configuration, @auto configuration, @component scan. So we discussed what is auto configuration with a practical example. If I add web starter, server is starting. If I add security starter, login page is coming. If I add JPS starter, connection pool will come. Auto configuration means it will identify what configuration required for the application and it will provide that configuration. Can you tell some examples for auto configuration in the Spring Boot? Security will come automatically when you add the dependency. Second example, Tomcat server coming automatically when I add web starter. Connection pooling will be created when I add the JPA starter. So these are some examples for auto configuration in the Spring Boot. Next one, what is component scanning? What is a component scanning? Component scanning is the process of identifying what are the Spring Bean classes available in our project. So in our project, multiple packages will be available. Some classes will be normal Java classes. Some classes will be Spring Bean classes. Some classes are normal Java classes. Some classes are Spring Bean classes. So when the class is a normal Java class, IOC will not consider that. IOC will not load that class. But when it is a Spring Bean, IOC will manage that. How to identify which is a Spring Bean, which is a not Spring Bean? That's where component scanning will come into picture. What is base package in the Spring Boot? Component scanning will work based on the base package. What is the base package? The package which contains the start class. The package which contains the start class is called as a base package. Component scanning will happen in the base package first. Then it will go for sub packages of the base package. What is the meaning of sub package of the base package? What is the meaning of sub package of the base package? The package name which is starting with the base package name is called as sub package of the base package. And the next one we discussed about, can we configure multiple base packages? Yes, is it possible or not possible? Yes, you can configure multiple base packages also. How to configure multiple base packages? By configuring @component scan with the packages is equal to array type. Then boot will consider multiple packages as base packages. It will scan all those packages. Okay, next one. We discussed about @component annotation. What is @component? What is @component? The class which you want to represent as a Spring Bean. If you want to represent your Java class as a Spring Bean, we can go for @component annotation. And the next one, @scope annotation. If you want to specify scope of the bean, if you don't specify the scope, by default it will become singleton. So I want to specify scope of the bean. For that we will go for @scope annotation. And the next one we discussed about configuration annotation. What is the meaning of configuration? What is the meaning of configuration? configuration is used to represent Java class as a configuration class. It is used to represent our Java class as a configuration class. We will go for configuration annotation. And the next one, we discussed about bean annotation. What is the meaning of bean annotation? If you want to customize bean object creation, I have a class. I don't want IOC to create the object. I want to create the object for my class. IOC should consider that object as a Spring Bean object. Then we will go for @bean method, where we can write @bean method, where we can write @bean method in any Spring Bean class. You can write in the start class, you can write in the configuration class, you can write in any Spring Bean class. IOC container will call that method. Then after, we discussed about auto wiring. What is auto wiring? What is auto wiring? Identify dependent object and inject dependent object into target object. Auto wiring, identify the dependent object and inject into target object by name, by type. By name and by type will be available. By name is available, by type is available. What is the meaning of a by name? What is the meaning of by name? Based on name of the variable, identify the dependent object. So if by name is not available, go for by type. So if a variable name and bin name is different, but still we can perform auto wiring with by name by using qualifier annotation. What is the purpose of qualifier? To identify bean object based on the name. To identify the bean object based on the name, we will go for qualifier. Next one, we have seen @primary. What is the meaning of @primary annotation? When we go for by type, there is a chance of ambiguity. So when there is a ambiguity, to tell which bean should be used to perform the dependency injection, we will go for primary annotation. Okay, good. Auto wiring with by name and by type. Then we discussed about Spring Boot banner. We discussed about Spring Boot banner. What is the banner in the Spring Boot? The logo that is printing on the console. We can set the mode, we can customize banner text also. And we discussed about runners in the Spring Boot. What is the purpose of runner? What is the purpose of runner in the Spring Boot? If you want to execute any logic only one time, then you can go for runners in the Spring Boot. How many types of runners available in the Spring Boot? There are two types of runners available in the Spring Boot. One is called application runner. Second one is called command line runner. What is the difference between application runner and command line runner? Parameter. Both are functional interfaces. Both are having run method. The parameters are different. Application runner will take application argument. Command line runner will take string argument. That is command line argument. Then we discussed about bean life cycle. We discussed about bean life cycle. What is bean life cycle? The process of executing life cycle methods. Okay, the class which is managed by IOC container is called as a Spring Bean class. When the IOC container managing our object, creation, destruction will be taken care by IOC. When the object is creating, when the object is removed from the container, I want to execute some life cycle methods. The life cycle methods you can execute in three ways: XML approach, programmatic approach, annotation approach. We have seen two approaches: programmatic approach and annotation approach. When you go for programmatic approach, what is the meaning of that? How do you achieve programmatic approach? By implementing interfaces. What are the interfaces? One is initializing bin. Second one is disposable bin. What is the method available in the initializing bin? After property set. When that method will be called? When after properties set method will be called? When the bean object is created, then after properties set method will be called. What is the disposable bin? Destroy method. When the IOC container is closing, it will remove all the objects. When all the objects are removing, it is going to call destroy method. Instead of implementing the interfaces, I can go for annotations also. What are the annotations available? One is post to construct, next one is pre-destroy. When you go for annotations, method names can be anything. When you implement a interface, you need to override the same methods. But when you go for annotation, the method name can be anything. Post to construct, pre-destroy. Post to construct will execute the method when the object is created. Pre-destroy will execute the method when the object is removed from the container. So this is what we learned so far in the Spring Boot. And here we discussed about the most important part. What is IOC container? What is IOC container? What is IOC container? IOC container is responsible to manage and collaborate dependencies among the objects. When we develop the application, multiple classes will be available. Layered architecture will be available. One class should communicate with the another class. When one class wants to communicate with the another class, I don't want to create the object. I don't want to inject the object. IOC container will take care of that. That's why it is called inversion of control. In our work is doing by IOC container. Actually, I am developing two classes. One class should communicate with the another class. So we need to create the object. We need to inject the object. Then we need to call the method. Instead of we are creating the object, we are injecting the object, IOC container doing that operation. That's why it is called inversion of control. Can you tell once again what is IOC? IOC is a principle which is responsible to manage and collaborate dependencies among the objects in the application. After that, we learnt about dependency injection. What is dependency injection? Injecting one class object into another class object is called dependency injection. We can also say injecting dependent object into target object is called dependency injection. The dependency injection we are performing with a setter injection. Okay, setter injection is available, SI, and we have constructor injection. So what is a setter injection? What is a constructor injection? Come on. Injecting dependent object into target object using target class setter method is called setter injection. What is constructor injection? Injecting dependent object into target object using target class constructor is called constructor injection. Next one, field injection. What is a field injection? Injecting dependent object into target object using target class variable directly is called field injection. When the variable is a private, how it will access from outside of the class? So private variables also we can access outside of the class using reflection API. IOC container using that reflection API to inject the value to the variable from outside. How many places we can use auto wiring annotation? 3 places: setter, constructor, field. If I perform both the setter and constructor for the variable, what will happen? Constructor will execute first, then setter will execute. Okay, that means setter injection will override constructor injection. Clear? Good. So a quick revision, what we learned in the last 15 to 20 days of time. Just read the topics. Online students, are you able to revise everything? Whatever we learned, almost 28 concepts. Spring versus boot, Spring Boot, advantages, how to create boot application, what is the folder structure when you create the boot application, what is the start class in the Spring Boot, what is the Spring application run method, how IOC will be started in the Spring Boot, what is the boot application annotation, what is auto configuration, what is component scanning, base package, what is base package, and naming conventions. When you are creating packages in the project, you need to follow proper naming conventions, and we can configure multiple base packages also. To represent Java class, Spring Bean, component, scope, configuration, bean, auto wiring, qualifier, primary, banner, runner, bean lifecycle, IOC container, dependency injection, setter injection, constructor injection, and field injection. Clear? Anybody having any questions on this? Anybody having any questions on this? Any topic that you are not able to understand? Anybody not able to understand any topic or any confusion, any doubts? Offline students. Anybody having any doubt? No doubts? Okay. Huh? Runner class. Okay. Yeah. So here we are creating our class which is implementing application runner. Then our class will become runner class. So we need to represent this as a Spring Bean so that when application is started, boot with IOC container is going to execute this runner. So inside this runner, we have a run method. Inside the run method, you can write any logic. That logic will execute only once when the project is started. Okay. So I told you scenario. In which scenario we need to use runner in our project? In which scenario we need to use runner in our project? Cache. Generally, I want to load the data from the database. I want to store in the cache. So cache creation will happen only one time when the project is started. So when you want to load the data from database to cache, that can be done by using runner. Yeah, you can send an email when the project is started. You can execute some scheduler when the project is started. You want to insert some data into master tables when the project is started. I want to delete some data from the staging tables when the project is started. So n number of requirements will be available where we need to execute the logic only one time when the project is started. For that, we will go for runner. Got it? Yes. Bean scopes. We discussed about bean scopes. What is bean scopes, guys? What is bean scope? Bean scope will decide how many objects should be created for a bean. How many objects should be created for a bean will be decided by bean scope. So if you don't specify any scope, then by default it will come under singleton. A singleton scope object will be created when the IOC container started. I want to go for prototype. That means whenever I get the object, then only create the new object. When I call get bean method, then only you create the object. On demand basis, if you want to create the object, you go for the scope as prototype. And we discussed about strategy design pattern. Okay. What is the strategy design pattern? Always we need to develop our application with the loosely coupling. So we can develop our application with tightly coupling as well as loosely coupling. Tightly coupling is not recommended because if one class functionality modified, it will affect on other class functionality. For that, we are going for loosely coupling. We'll go for loosely coupling. To achieve loosely coupling, we need to develop our classes with interfaces. Always interface will provide loosely coupling for the application. Good. Fine. Next one. Guys, in the interview, they will ask you a question. In the interview, they will ask you a question. Setter injection, constructor injection, setter injection, constructor injection, field injection is available. Which one is recommended? Okay. Setter injection is available, constructor injection is available, and field injection is available. Out of this, which injection is recommended? Now, first if I talk about field injection recommended or not recommended? Field injection not recommended. Why the field injection not recommended? It is violating OOPS principle. It is using reflection API, which will decrease performance of the application. As per OOPS concepts, private variables should be accessed only within the class. But when I go for field injection, private variable accessed outside of the class also with the help of reflection. That's why it is not recommended. The reason for not recommended, first reason, violating OOPS principles. Violating OOPS principles. Now, second reason for this one is it will violating single responsibility principle. What is that? Violating single responsibility principle. That means in one target class, you can inject multiple dependents. Now you see my service is available, user service. How many dependents available? 3. First of all the 3 are private variables. For these variables, I am writing @auto void. Then field injection will happen. It will use the reflection API to access these variables outside of the class. First reason why field injection not recommended. Second reason, that is whenever we are developing our application, we need to develop the application by following solid OOPS principles. We know OOPS principles: inheritance, polymorphism, abstraction, encapsulation. Along with that, we need to follow solid OOPS principles. There is a concept called solid OOPS principle. In the solid OOPS principle, S stands for single responsibility principle. O stands for open closed principle. Open closed principle. L stands for Liskov substitution principle. Okay. And I stands for interface segregation principle. Okay. D stands for dependency inversion principle. When you are developing our application, not only OOPS concepts, guys, we are also going to follow solid OOPS principle. The full form for the solid: S stands for single responsibility principle, O stands for open closed principle, L stands for Liskov substitution principle, I stands for interface segregation, D stands for dependency inversion. So if you want to develop a project with loosely coupling, with better design, with best practices, then you need to follow solid OOPS principles. You need to follow solid OOPS principles in order to develop your application with the best practices. So in the solid OOPS principles, S stands for single responsibility. That means one class should perform only one operation. But if you see here, I'm writing one service class. My service class is talking to three different classes to perform three different operations. Am I following single responsibility principle? No. One class should perform only one operation, but my class is talking to three other classes to perform the operation. When we perform code review also, that code review tool also will not tell that this class is violating single responsibility principle. So you can inject multiple dependent objects into target object by using auto wiring with the field injection. So it will violate OOPS principle and it will violate single responsibility principle. Because of these two reasons, field injection not recommended to use. But most of the people will use field injection only. Most of the people will use field injection, but it is not recommended. Why people will use only field injection? Simple. I no need to write any setter method. I no need to write any constructor. If I just write one annotation on the variable, dependency injection will happen. It is easy to use but not recommended. Why not recommended? Violating OOPS principle and it will not maintain single responsibility principle. Okay. Next one. Let us go for setter injection. Let us go for setter injection. What is the meaning of setter injection? What is the meaning of setter injection? Injecting dependent object into target object by calling target class setter method. Injecting dependent object into target object by using target class setter method is called setter injection. When we go for setter injection, when you go for setter injection, without dependent object, target object can be created. Without a dependent object, target object created. When you go for the setter, here, first target object will be created. First target object and then dependent object will be created. Okay. When you go for setter injection, we need to call target class setter method. To call the target class setter method, first it has to create the target object. Once the target object is created, then only it will check for the dependent object. Then it will call the setter method. Suppose if dependent object is not available, what will happen? Null pointer exception will occur. Still target object will be created, but dependent object is not available. Then null pointer exceptions will occur. When you go for constructor injection, first dependent object will be created. First dependent object will be created and then target object will be created. Okay. So when you go for constructor injection, guys, for example, I'm writing constructor for this class. I'm writing I'm writing constructor for this class. I'm removing these variables. Is it valid or invalid? Valid or invalid? Valid. Dependency injection will happen or dependency injection will not happen? Will happen. With which type of injection? Constructor injection will happen because my class is having only parameterized constructor. IOC container don't have any other option to create the object. IOC container should call my parameterized constructor to create the object. Okay. Now here, first of all, this user service is a Spring Bean. This is my target. So this target is having three dependents. Okay. Now when you go for constructor, in order to create the object for the target class, constructor should be executed. Okay, I don't have a zero param constructor. I have only parameterized constructor. So it has to call that constructor to create the object. In order to call this constructor, it has to pass constructor parameters. What are the constructor parameters? Dependent object. So target object will be created first. Dependent object will be created first. No. In order to create the target, understand. Now, I have a user service. Can I say user service is a Spring Bean? How can we say user service is a Spring Bean? How can we say user service is a Spring Bean? User service is a Spring Bean because it is having @service. It is having @service. So when this user service is a Spring Bean, IOC container should create the object for the Spring Bean. IOC container should create the object for the Spring Bean. In order to create the object, what is the option available? To create the object, it should call the constructor. How many constructors available? Zero param constructor or parameterized constructor. Parameterized constructor is available. So IOC should call only this parameterized constructor to create the object. But that constructor having some parameters. What are those parameters? Dependent objects. Dependent objects are the parameters. So to call this constructor, already dependent bean should be ready. If dependent bean is ready, then only it can pass dependent bean as a parameter and it will call the constructor. So which object will create first? Dependent object will create first. When you go for constructor injection, dependent object will be created first, then target object will be created. If the dependent object is not available, application will not start. If the dependent object is not available, target class object also will not be created. So always recommended, create the dependent first, then create the target. If the dependent is not available, then target also should not be created because my class is dependent on the other class. If the dependent class is not available, is there any use of the target class? If the dependent class not available, is there any use of target class? There is no use of target class. That means partial dependency injection not possible. If all the dependent objects are available, then only target object will be created. So there are three arguments available. One is password service, one is DAO, another one is email. All we are passing as a arguments for the constructor. If three dependents available, then only target object will be created. First dependent objects will be created, then only target object will be created. If any dependent object is not available, then target object also will not be created. So now, if I have two objects, two dependents available, third dependent not available, then understand. My class is having dependency with three classes, three dependents available. Out of three dependents, two dependent objects are ready, one dependent object not available. Can we perform partial dependency injection? Can we inject those two objects which are available? Can we skip the object which is not available? No. If three objects are available, then only this constructor will be executed. So that means partial dependency injection possible or not possible? When you go for the constructor injection, partial dependency injection not possible. But in the setter, in CI, partial dependency injection not supported. If my target is dependent on three objects, if three objects are available, then only create the target. Out of these three, if any one is missing, don't create the target. That means partial dependency injection not supported. This is actually we want. If all the dependents are available, then only create the target. If any dependent is not available, don't create the target object. Clear? Now, if I go for setter, method, setter injection, I'm writing setter method. I will specify at the rate auto void and I will specify at the rate auto void. If I specify auto wiring at the setter method level, then setter injection will happen. Okay, 1 minute. Yeah, constructor is there. You understand what is happening with the constructor? Yes, constructor injection. What is the constructor injection? Injecting dependent object into target object using target class constructor. Injecting dependent object into target object using target class constructor is called constructor injection. When we go for constructor injection, dependent will be created first or a target will be created first? Dependent will be created first. If the dependent is created, then only target will be created. Can we perform partial dependency injection with the constructor? No. If a constructor expecting 3 dependents, all the 3 should be available, then only target will be created. Out of 3, if any one is not available, target object will not be created. That means partial dependency injection not supported when you go for constructor injection. Are you clear? Good. Next one, let me go for setter. Generate getters and setters, only setters. Now, I have generated setters. Constructor not required. So when I specify auto wiring, so setter method should be called to perform setter injection. Setter method should be called to perform setter injection. To call that setter method, target object is required. So here, when you go for the setter, which object should be created first? Why target? When you go for constructor, dependent object is creating first, because to call the target class constructor, dependent should be passed as a parameter. So that's why dependent will be created first, then the dependent will be passed to the constructor of the target. Then if you come to setter injection, what is the meaning of setter injection? What is the meaning of setter injection? Injecting dependent object into target object using target class setter method. Okay. To call setter method of the target class, target object is required. If I want to call that setter method, first of all, target object is required. So here, which one will be created first? Target. Why target is creating first? To call that method, we need the object, right? To call that setter method, we need the object. So that's why target object will be created first, then dependent object will be created. Okay. So that is what. When you go for setter, first target object, then dependent object will be created. Is it mandatory to call all the setter methods? Suppose I removed auto wiring for one method. Then IOC container will call all the 3 setter methods, or IOC container will call only these 2 setter methods. Why only 2? That means my class requires 3 dependents. But if I write the code like this, IOC will inject all the 3, or IOC inject only 2. IOC will inject only 2. So that means partial dependency injection. So when you perform partial dependency injection by mistake, if any programmer forgot to write auto void annotation, if the programmer forgot to write auto void annotation at the method level, then that setter method will not be called. Then partial dependency injection will happen. There is a chance of getting null pointer exception. So setter is recommended or not recommended? Not recommended. Why not recommended? Partial dependency injection. If you forgot to write the auto wiring at the method level, that method will not be called, that dependent will not be injected, then you will get the null pointer exception in the application. So out of these three, which one is recommended? Always better to go for constructor injection. When you go for constructor injection, first dependent object will be created, then dependent will be injected to target. If the dependent is not available, then target will not be created. And when you go for the constructor, all the dependents are mandatory. Partial injection not possible. If any dependent is not available, then target also will not be created. So better to use constructor injection in the project so that we can avoid null pointer exceptions. We can avoid partial injections. So we have constructor injection, setter injection, and field injection. Setter, constructor, field. Out of these three, which one is recommended? Out of here, when you go for setter, partial, what is the meaning of partial dependency injection? What is the meaning of partial dependency injection supported? What is the meaning of partial dependency injection supported? If three dependents are available, I can inject only two. It's not mandatory to inject all the three. So because setter method will be called after the target is created. If any three dependents are available, I can inject only two dependents. Partial injection possible. When you go for partial injection, what is the problem? There is a chance of getting null pointer exception. So out of CI, SI and FI, it is recommended, come on, it is recommended to use CI. Why? What is the advantage? First dependent will be created, then only target. All the dependents are mandatory into target. So we don't get any null pointer exception when you go for constructor injection. Clear? Good. Now, go through solid OOPS principles, guys. In the interview, they are asking the question on what are solid OOPS principles, where you have used in the project. Today, you do some research on solid OOPS principles. Okay. Now, solid acronym. S stands for single responsibility. O stands for open close. L stands for Liskov substitution. I stands for interface segregation. D stands for dependency inversion. Good. Now, guys, here we discussed about one more question. At the rate component, at the rate service, at the rate repository. These three annotations, 1 minute. At the rate component, at the rate service, at the rate repository, there are three annotations available. What is the purpose of all these three annotations? To represent our Java class as a Spring Bean. Now, why three annotations to do the same task? Right? When you go for repository, we will use the repository in the DAO layer. What is the extra benefit we are getting? It will convert SQL exceptions into Java based exceptions. Okay. Exception translation is the extra benefit we are getting. Okay. So SQL exception translation, the extra benefit we are having with the repository. When you are writing a Java class to communicate with the database, it can be normal JDBC, Spring JDBC, Hibernate or Spring ORM. Any Java class which is responsible to communicate with the database. For that class, we will use @repository to represent that Java class as a Spring Bean. So any Java class which is responsible to communicate with the database, that class we will represent as a Spring Bean by using @repository. Sir, instead of repository, can I use a component also? Yes, we can use component also. Then what is the extra benefit we are getting with the repository? Exception translation. Whenever you communicate with the database, if there is any problem in your code, some SQL exception will occur. That SQL exception will be converted, will be translated into Java exception. That is the only extra benefit we are getting with the repository. Otherwise, you can use a component also for the repository. But what is the recommended annotation for the DOL classes? Repository. So repository means it is a persistence layer class which is responsible to communicate with the database. When I use @repository, IOC container will consider that class as a Spring Bean and it will create object for that bean. Good. Next one, service. Service is specialized version of a component. It is specialized version of component. When our classes are having business logic, when our project class business logic is available, the classes which contains a business logic, those classes we will represent as a @service, just to represent it is a service class. Whatever the benefit we have with the component, same thing is available with the service also. There is no extra benefit. Only for the repository, we have a benefit. What is the benefit for the repository? Exception translation. The benefit for the repository is exception translation. Are you clear? Good. When you go for component or service, we are going to get the same functionality. Then why to use the service? Service will represent your Java class as a business class. When someone look at the class which is having @service, they will understand this is a Spring Bean which contains business logic. And normal Java classes are available. In my project, I want to send email utility. I want to encrypt my password. I want to send OTP by using some Java classes. Any generic Java classes can be represented as a Spring Bean by using component. In place of component, you can use a service and repository also. In place of repository, you can use component and service also. In place of service, you can use component. All three can be used at any place. But a repository having one extra benefit. What is that extra benefit? Exception translation is available. When our Java application communicating with the database, there is a chance of getting the exception. That exception will be translated into Java exception. SQL exception will be translated into Java exception. Clear? Good. Any questions? This mic is irritating, sir. Anybody having any question? Anybody having any question? Okay. Guys, tomorrow we don't have class because tomorrow is election. Some people are going for vote. We have next class on Friday. Okay. Friday, we will start with data JPA. So Spring Boot basic part got completed. So please revise all the topics that we discussed in the Spring Boot and practice all the examples. So on Fridays, in the Friday session, we will start with Spring Data JPA. So if you have time, I have already uploaded one video how to develop our first application by using Spring Data JPA to communicate with Oracle database and MySQL database. So I will share that video. Please go through that and try to develop that application. developing data JPA application, creating first data JPA application. Where is that? Yeah, Spring Data JPA application with the Oracle database. So 3 months back, I have given this video. If you go through this video, you will understand how to create our first project by using data JPA. So you go through that video so that you will understand how to create that project and how to execute that. So once I explain in the class, you will get a better clarity, data JPA. So in the Friday session, we will start with our data JPA. So data JPA, which is used to develop persistence layer in our application. Good, go through that. And anyone who don't have database, in my course, I'm going to use MySQL database. Online students, if anyone don't have that MySQL database, I gave one video to set up MySQL database in the system. Okay, I will share this video to install MySQL database along with the workbench. You can use either Oracle or MySQL. I'm going to use MySQL database. Oracle example only I have uploaded in the YouTube. How to communicate with the Oracle database by using Spring Data JPA. So before coming to next session on Friday, database setup should be done and try to practice first application by using data JPA. I will explain that in the class. Once you listen to the second time, you will get better clarity. Good? Fine. Thank you guys. With this, I'm stopping for today. We'll meet again on Friday. Yeah, interface injection, I will explain, sir. In the data JPA, I will show you how to work with that interface injection. Okay. And one more thing, guys. So Java real-time project batch I have announced. It will be starting from 11th December from 6 p.m. So on the 11th December by 6 p.m. the Java real-time project batch is going to start. So that is also classroom and online training will be available for that. By the time we start the project, our data JPA, almost WebMVC also will be completed. So whatever the prerequisites are there for the project development, those things will be completed in the morning session. So you need to attend morning class and evening class. Morning boot microservice, evening project development. Thank you.